It's sometimes also been suggested that the ANC was more ruthless than de Klerk, that they were willing to keep on with violence against rivals and against ordinary people. There were a whole number of random attacks on commuters that began in late 1993. There were the Appler attacks on whites, which seemed to have been perpetrated at least with some kind of alignment with MK. And if you wanted the violence to stop, and if you wanted a stable society, then perhaps it really was important to agree to what the ANC was saying it needed, and which it said would be the best thing for the country.
Hello, my name is Donald, and welcome to the #1 media company, WorldView. At WorldView, we explore everyone's perspectives on all things that can broaden our worldview. Today, we're talking again with Dr. Anthea Jeffery. Anthea is a legal scholar and the head of policy research at the Institute of Race Relations. She has authored 11 books, including the one I want to talk about, The People's War: New Light on the Struggle for South Africa. It is an absolute eye-opener, and throughout this conversation, you're going to realize you have to buy it. You have to get it to delve into the finer details. So, Anthea, welcome back to the show. It's so great to have you back on. The last interview we did got about 140,000 views. So let's hope this one beats that one. So
I do hope so.
Anthea, the People's War. What is the People's War, and what did the ANC people like Oliver Tambo learn from their journey to Vietnam, the Vietnam experience?
In essence, the People's War was a multifaceted and far more sophisticated strategy than the armed struggle on which the ANC had embarked in 1961. The armed struggle just focused on setting off bomb blasts, hoping that would spark an insurrection, and it never worked. The People's War, by contrast, is a very complicated thing. To give some picture of it, it's important to emphasize that it has always two key elements. There's always the political struggle on the one hand and the military struggle on the other, and the two must always be there. They act as the two arms of the pincer, or as the hammer and the anvil between which adversaries are crushed. So in South Africa, what did the political struggle comprise? Things that many people will know about. There were stairways, strikes, school boycotts, consumer boycotts, rent boycotts, economic sanctions. And all these create a sense of ferment, which creates a kind of cover or justification for the military struggle, And the military struggle is called the Program of Violence in Vietnamese. And it still involves bomb blasts, but those are really a very small part of the whole. A lot of the focus is on terror attacks directed against the ordinary population. And in South Africa, it was the necklace executions, in which a tire was hung around the neck of the victim and then set alight, which was so effective in terrorizing people. There were also targeted attacks on Black councillors living in the townships, Black policemen, and very much the ANC's Black rivals in the Black consciousness movement and in Carter. And why did you need the two in combination? The political struggle would create this sense of ferment so that the actions of violence would not seem so extraordinary. But the actions of violence would persuade people to take part in the political struggle. In South Africa, despite the obvious huge rejection of apartheid, people were also worried. They didn't want to take part in a stay away and lose wages or maybe a job. They didn't want to take part in a consumer boycott and have to pay higher prices, or in a rent boycott and maybe lose access to their township home. They were worried that if their kids went on school boycotts, they'd be out on the streets and losing on essential schooling. But once the necklace began, it became very easy, in fact, to coerce people to take part in those various kinds of mass action. In fact, in the end, all you needed was an activist going up and down a queue where people were waiting for a taxi, say, shaking a box of matches, which became the known symbol of the necklace, and reminding people that there was a stay away or some other protest called quite soon, and people would get the message and they would take part. So that's why you need the two, and they must work in combination. And this is part of what the ANC learned when they went to Vietnam. They did so in October 1978. It was a small but senior delegation, mostly people from the SACP, led by Oliver Tambo. They weren't there very much at the instance of Moscow, which was getting worried about the fact that the ANC was being supplanted by other organizations within the country. And they went 3 years after the defeat of South Vietnam by the North, which had been, of course, a signal moment and showed that even a powerful military adversary, such as the South backed by the US, could be defeated. And they also went within a year of the collapse of the Soweto revolt. That had begun in 1976. It had been very exciting because it showed that mass insurrection was still possible, but it had also petered out a year later. And what was most worrying about it from the ANC's perspective was that it had been sparked by the Black Consciousness Organizations, BC, by people who were basically followers of Steve Biko, not by the ANC at all. Secondly, when it came to an end and people counted the cost of all these young kids mown down on the streets by the police, there was much more support for Nkarta's non-violent approach to liberation. And by 1979, Nkarta had a membership of some 300,000 people, which was 3 times more than the ANC had ever had at the height of its popularity in the 1950s. So the ANC had reason to fear internal rivals, and the formula for People's War in Vietnam had also enabled the National Liberation Front there to crush its internal rivals. So that was another reason for great interest in the lessons from Vietnam. The highlight of the trip was a meeting with General Vo Nguyen Giap, often known as the Red Napoleon, who had really been the author of the North's defeat of the South. And under his guidance, the ANC SACP delegation was very much instructed in all the features of People's War. They came back, they adopted a document called the Green Book, Lessons from Vietnam, and they decided to set about implementing a People's War. And they did so very much with the help of the Soviet Union, which was important in providing money, providing armaments, training, but very much also in providing practical guidance. Because as Irina Filatova has written, there were people in Moscow like Vladimir Shubin who'd been working with liberation movements for years. And he in particular had worked with the ANC and the SACP for years. He could give them practical guidance day by day based on all of Moscow's experience of trying to promote People's War in different areas. And the old Africa hands like Shubin were still available even after the fall of the Soviet Union. And that very much was what enabled the inept ANC, which had failed to make a success of the armed struggle, to implement the People's War with significant success.
So, Anthea, what you're basically telling me is that there's this common conception that it's apartheid and the conditions of apartheid that create that ungovernable situation in South Africa. Not to seek a justification for apartheid, but that's the common understanding. But what you're telling me is it's essentially the ANC and the People's War that made South Africa ungovernable.
That indeed was the slogan with which the People's War was launched. It was apparently coined by Thabo Mbeki, who was then a member of the Politburo of the SACP. The call was to make South Africa ungovernable by a mix of various things through the role of MK, through mass action, through economic sanctions, and so on. But this was a very edited version of what the People's War was going to be about. The fact that you would have this combination of political and military struggle, and that the aim would be primarily to weaken and, if possible, eliminate your black rivals, was not something that was advertised for obvious reasons.
On that note, how popular was the ANC before the negotiations started? Because once again, we have this idea that the ANC was always the leader of black people, the opposition in South Africa. But in your book, you lay out that was not at all the case.
Yes, if you take negotiations as beginning, say, in February 1990, when the ANC was unbanned by F.W. de Klerk, at that point, it was difficult to tell what its strength was because it had been banned for 30 years. On the other hand, there had been opinion polling done in the townships in the late 1980s, where people were asked about the strategies which the ANC espoused, economic sanctions and political violence. And there was great rejection of those strategies by Black South Africans. About 75% of Black respondents were opposed to them. Then it was often said that the UDF was really the internal surrogate of the ANC, and it had a great deal of support. But again, the UDF commonly claimed to have 600 affiliates, say, and to have roughly 2 million supporters. But this was really also based on the lessons from Vietnam, where a similar united front had been established, had claimed vast amount of members, something like 7 million, when in fact it had about 220,000. And the UDF was something on a rather similar scale, just a little bit smaller. Many of the organizations that belonged to the UDF were not mass organizations. They were a narrow group of activists who got together in a township and decided to form, say, a civic association. And then the same group might form a residents association. And then there would be 2 UDF affiliates in one township giving an impression of support, though in fact it was the same small group, 6 or 7 people who'd formed them both. Some of the affiliates did have mass support, particularly the Congress of South African Students, COSATS, and the Azanian Students Organization, AZASO. They had been formed by BC organizations and then had been kind of induced in various ways to come in with the ANC and join the Charterist cause. But on the whole, the UDF was a weak organization. And that was particularly so in KwaZulu-Natal, where Inkatha was a strong organization. And that was actually, to me, very interesting to see, because the UDF was formed very much at the instance of Indian and colored activists in 1983 in KwaZulu-Natal. And they battled to find Black people to serve on the regional committee. And those that they did find, including some well-known names like Dr. Deliza MG and Victoria Nqenge, were not Zulu. And there was a widespread perception in the region that the UDF was the puppet of this Indian cabal that had formed it. And by contrast, Inkatha in 1990 had a claimed membership of 1.8 million. It had succeeded in stopping grand apartheid by refusing independence for KwaZulu. It had forced the white government to keep looking for another solution. It was opposed to economic sanctions. And what it said really resonated with people. They too thought economic sanctions would make for more poverty and more unemployment. It was opposed to school boycotts because it said children needed to learn so that they could run the government in the new South Africa. It was very much opposed to the violence because it said apartheid is crumbling already and we don't need violence. We need now a negotiated settlement. And it said we don't need to make South Africa ungovernable, and there's great risk in doing that. And when Buthulezi predicted that it would remain ungovernable after liberation. And there's always been an element of that. And as the lawlessness now increases, you wonder if he was perhaps particularly prescient. So there was a lot of support for the IFP, and it wasn't only in KwaZulu-Natal. They had something like 50 branches in Soweto, almost the same number in the Vaal Triangle south of Johannesburg, and about 100 branches on the East Rand. So the ANC had real concern that when the first all-race election was held, the white vote wouldn't matter. White minority far too small, but it would matter what Black people voted for. And the risks were that they would vote for the IFP. And the ANC's own assessment in 1992 was that even on 100% turnout, it would battle to win 50% of the vote. So it had particular reason to attack and try and weaken the IFP before negotiations really got going, and certainly before the first all-race election was held.
And what is very interesting to me is if you go to other African countries, they can't understand why South Africans are so violent. Do you think the People's War is the reason? The violence orchestrated by the ANC has effects to this very day. That's one of the main reasons why South Africa is such a violent country.
I think there's a risk that is exactly what was done. People were encouraged to use violence. Normal constraints against violence were diminished. The police became a target of attack. We can talk about to what extent they became a target of attack. And that also isn't a very powerful symbol of attacking the law and order and authority. People were encouraged not to pay their rent. And we have now a situation where they still don't pay their rent in the form of either rates to municipalities or payments for electricity and so on. And the amount currently owed to the municipalities is something like 255 billion rand. I think when you start taking out the props which hold up law and order in a society, which maintain the rule of law within it, it's difficult to put them back. It's as if you take the genie out of the bottle and then you can't just stuff it in again.
Okay, so how were the CODESA negotiations part of the People's War?
Well, when CODESA began in December 1991, the ANC had really perhaps two key goals. One was to make sure that it could retain its MK fighters. It already had about 13,000 of them back inside the country, allowed to return under the cover of the peace and negotiating process. And the ANC had refused to disband and disarm them, and it continued with that refusal. It wanted them rather to become part of its self-defense units, which meant they would be available for the program of violence in the years ahead. What they also wanted to achieve was an interim appointed administration, an administration which would effectively have more power than the parliament and the cabinet, which still remained in place, which would be able to rule by decree, which would be able to help in weakening its internal rivals, and which would be able to help in making sure that the first race election was conducted in a way which benefited the ANC. Those were its two goals. De Klerk had two different goals. He wanted Umkhonto to be disarmed and disbanded, and he made that demand very clear and very strong on the first day of CODESA. And he was really very strongly slapped on, I think is the right word, by Mandela, who vociferously refused to entertain such a notion. And secondly, he wanted an election in 1992. He agreed that there should be an interim administration, but he thought it should be an elected one. And he said that the executive should be split between the three big parties, the National Party, the ANC, and the IFP, and they should spend about 5 years crafting the best constitution for the country. And that was anathema to the ANC too. It would have meant an end to minority rule in 1992, but the ANC wasn't yet ready to confront the IFP in an election. And so the ANC rejected that, and other participants at CODESA went with what the ANC wanted. And for the first few months, the ANC was really able to call the shots at CODESA until things changed in May 1992, when the second full meeting of CODESA was held. And there, a number of the smaller parties had become worried about ANC domination in the new South Africa. They thought it would be a good thing to have a strongly federal constitution with strong powers for the regions or provinces. So when the National Party said that regional powers should be decided by a 75% majority, a very high supermajority, it was backed by 10 of the participants at CODESA, and only 7 backed the ANC. So of the 19 participants, 11 for the National Party position and only 8 for the ANC. So the ANC had now lost a vote on a matter absolutely crucial to it and its future hegemony. It reacted by saying that de Klerk had deadlocked the whole of CODESA, which was hardly true, and that now the solution was to use rolling mass action to push de Klerk out of the exit gate and set up that interim administration that it had long wanted. And it started a program of rolling mass action from the 16th June, the anniversary of Soweto. Many people stayed away, as they always did, but that really didn't mean that they supported the ANC. It also called 70 rallies to show the extent of the support for the demand to push de Klerk out, and it had to cancel almost all of them because there was so little attendance. So its mass action was in danger of petering out. It needed a spark to reinvigorate it. And that spark came in the form of what we now know as the Boipatong massacre. And the background there was that IFP supporters in the Vaal Triangle, people living in townships and in hostels, had been pushed out of their homes and hostel rooms in increasing number with the return of MK fighters who were armed and trained, and a whole number of attacks on IFP people which had gone generally unremarked. and they had taken refuge in a disused Iskor hostel called Kwamadala, the old place. But they'd continued to suffer attack whenever they left the sanctuary of the hostel. And then in the run-up to the 16th June that year, there were 3 necklacings of deemed IFP supporters, people who were Zulu. And this really brought anger to boiling point. The residents of Kwamadala decided they were going to take revenge on Boipatong, because Boipatong was a township which harbored the youths, which carried out the attacks on them. So they organized the attack, and at 9:30 on the 17th of June, they sallied forth. Their aim had been initially to attack the self-defense unit, but when they couldn't find that, they began to wreak a sort of random revenge on the residents of Boipatong. 45 people were killed, many of them women and children. Then they withdrew. The police Caspers began arriving, armored vehicles began arriving at about 10 o'clock, half an hour after the attack began, finding scenes of murder and mayhem. But there was no particular anger against the police to begin with. But that changed the following morning when the ANC began to allege that the police had both planned and participated in the killings. And at that stage, the ANC used the Boipatong massacre to break off all negotiations and to declare Kadesa completely dead. It said the attack had been carried out by Inkatha, helped by the police. That meant de Klerk was implicated too, that it could no longer talk to the National Party and de Klerk when they were killing Black people because they were Black, just as the Nazi Party had killed Jews because they were Jews. So highly damning allegations. The negotiations ended. De Klerk was weakened, and then he was weakened again 3 months later by the Bishu massacre, in which 29 people were killed. And here there was a lot of evidence that the ANC had led its supporters pretty much like lambs to the slaughter before the guns of a very spooked and inefficient Ciskei Defence Force. And the result was that very many people were killed and injured. But de Klerk ultimately was again to blame for the actions of this Homeland Army, and he then capitulated. He signed what was called the Record of Understanding, which set up a new multi-party negotiating process in due course. And effectively, it allowed the ANC and its allies to dominate the negotiations from there on. De Klerk found himself completely isolated from the support that he had been found at Kadesa when 10 other parties backed him. Instead, he was locked into bilateral negotiations with the ANC, which the ANC always won because they had legitimacy and nobody understood their role in violence and how they were trying to change the negotiations. And so de Klerk would capitulate, and then what was agreed between the ANC and the National Party would be rubber stamped by all the other parties. And the one organization that refused to go along with this was the IFP. Buthulezi withdrew from the negotiations because he said there were no genuine talks taking place at all. But by then, the IFP had also come under an extraordinary degree of attack, which had generally not been understood, not been remarked.
Anthea,
and perhaps,
yes, go ahead.
I was going to say, perhaps that level of attack is important too to understand for people to have some more information about.
The level of attack?
On the IFP, yes.
Okay, I don't know specifically what you're referring to, but yes, go ahead.
Well, you know, if People's War was all about military struggles and political struggles, how was this deployed against the IFP? I think that really would be the question. But before one gets to that, one must also ask, why was the violence so much more intense in the negotiations period? We know that in the first 5 years of the People's War from 1984 to 1989, about 5,500 people were killed in the sort of atmosphere of ungovernability and mayhem that the People's War had ushered in. But in the next period, when de Klerk had already thrown open the door to democracy, you didn't have to batter it down. The violence greatly intensified. There were 15,000 people killed in those next 5 years, almost 3 times as many. And it was a reflection on the fact that the ANC knew that if they were to prevail in negotiations, they had to intensify the violence. The more the escalating political killings happened, the more social instability there would be, the more economic malaise there would be, and the more the negotiators from other parties would feel constrained to go along with ANC proposals that they might otherwise have resisted if this would end the ferment and restore stability. And at the same time, you needed to weaken the IFP. So all these things came together in the period from 1990 to 1993, during which the attacks on the IFP accelerated enormously. There had been roughly 2,400 attacks in KwaZulu-Natal in those first 5 years of the People's War. The police said that of the dead, the Inkatha people were the great majority. But whereas there'd been a sort of relatively limited number of attacks on Inkatha leaders in the first 5 years, 3 of them killed in 1985, 54 of them killed in 1989. After 1990, the death toll among IFP leaders really rose very fast, so that by September 1993, more than 300 of them had been killed. So how were they killed? Just to give some examples of the sort of attacks. In April 1991, Joseph Khumalo, who was the mayor of Diepsloot in Deep, I always get muddled, it's a Deep Kloof, I think, in Soweto, and also the chairman of the IFP branch there. He got a late night phone call saying he must come to an emergency meeting. So he got in the car and drove off, and then he was ambushed. As he got close to the meeting place, a hand grenade was thrown at his car. He slewed to a halt, he got out, and he was shot dead. In Umlazi, in Natal, another key IFP leader was Winnington Sabella, and he was in his shop busy serving people when 2 people came in pretending to be customers. They asked for items, he turned his back on them, they took out their guns and shot him dead before making their escape in a getaway car. There was Fana Nzimande, who was a headman in the Patani region in the Midlands. And he and his wife and their 6 children were ordered by gunmen to line up against the wall of his kraal. And then they were all shot dead as if by firing squad. I exaggerate. 2 of the children survived, though they had severe injuries. And then there was the Table Mountain massacre in March 1993. This took place in the Table Mountain area near Pietermaritzburg, not Cape Town. And there, the children of known IFP supporters were being transported to school in a little truck or a bakkie. And the bakkie was ambushed, it was brought to a halt. And then it was sprayed with AK-47 fire for some 10 minutes, killing 6 of the children. These were the kinds of attacks that were taking place on the IFP. But they were, as it were, rather isolated incidents. They didn't generally get much coverage. Something like the Boipatong massacre, in which 45 people were killed, attracted worldwide coverage. And it was partly because the attacks on the IFP were smaller, persistent, low level, continuing, but not at the level of Boipatong, that they were more easily ignored. And so it seemed that most of the violence was being perpetrated by Inkatha. And so Buthulezi in 1993, when he held a press conference and he said, I now have 305 IFP leaders who've been assassinated in these kinds of conditions. And the press seemed to have no interest. He said, I don't see how we can have fair negotiations or a fair election when people are being shot for belonging to the wrong political party. But there was very little sympathy or understanding of his view. He withdrew from negotiations. He was dismissed as a spoiler. And he came back in only a week before the 1994 poll, when the ANC promised international mediation on the key question of what federal powers there would be in the new South Africa. On that basis, he agreed to contest the election. But then after the election, the ANC reneged on that agreement and simply refused to implement it. And again, there was very little coverage of that about turn.
So essentially what the ANC did is they waged a war of attrition against the IFP. They made a lot more small killings than the IFP did in their revenge attacks, and that received little news coverage.
Indeed, you know, you could, when I was writing the book, I could find out all this information if I looked for it. But it wasn't what most people, just reading the newspapers in a more casual way, listening to the news in a more casual way, would be aware of. They would be aware of the big events like Boipatong, but not aware of the succession of smaller events in which the IFP was so often the target. And you see the 2 arms of the pincer. You've got the military struggle with this level of attack against the IC, You've got the political struggle, which absolutely critically involves propaganda. And the propaganda is all the time blaming the INC as being the principal perpetrator of the violence. And events like Boipatong are put out as the examples of how the IFP is responsible for all the violence. And it's a convincing explanation, given the little that most people know about the great number of smaller attacks that are also taking place.
Anthea, what I also found fascinating in your book, and perhaps you obviously know this story better than I do, is this specific academic, a doctor or a professor, that convinced Prince Buthulezi to take part in the election. And he said something along the lines of, if you don't do it, this is Africa, they're going to get rid of you. I think you can perhaps tell that story better than I can.
Yes, I'm just gone blank on the name. Yes, but you're absolutely right. It was just before the election, shortly after the Shell House massacre, in which 8 IFP protesters had been gunned down by ANC security guards, in what a judicial inquest was later to find a completely unjustified shooting. Emergency rule had been declared in KwaZulu-Natal. The violence against IFP supporters was ongoing, though there were, of course, always retaliatory attacks by the IFP, which enjoyed more support. And if the IFP didn't take part in the election, what would happen next? And indeed, this professor warned Buthulezi that this was Africa, that he would face an absolutely concerted onslaught from the new government once the election had taken place. And it would be much better if he did participate in the election, if he could show the support that he and the IFP had, and that would give him some kind of bargaining strength in the Constituent Assembly. And he also had this promise of international mediation, which in the end the ANC didn't honor.
And that's essentially how the entire opposition, like the Freedom Alliance, capitulated against the ANC, is this fear that, I mean, if you don't go their way, they're gonna get rid of you. I mean, that's essentially how the Freedom Front, I believe the Freedom Front also capitulated. The townships, not the Bantustans, capitulated one by one. They were systematically eliminated by this essential criminal organization, a mafia organization that is the ANC.
Yeah, the ANC was greatly helped in those final few months by the Transitional Executive Council. This was effectively the appointed interim administration that it had wanted. So though we still had a parliament and we still had de Klerk as president, the key decisions were now being made by the TEC, and it was very much an ANC-dominated institution. And it was able to work, to operate very effectively to eliminate the remaining homeland administrations which were opposed to the ANC, particularly the Boipatong administration and the Ciskei one as well. And perhaps just worth talking about the Boipatong one, because that brought the side benefit of also kind of eliminating the Freedom Front as a contender. The Freedom Front was never confronted militarily because it was too powerful, I would say. It's my guess. It was started in May 1993 by Constant Viljoen, who was a former chief of the army, and other generals who said, we can't have negotiations, we can't have a fair and free election in this atmosphere of violence and chaos. So what we need to do is to have Umkhonto confined to base. We need to bring the violence to an end, and then we can give the constitution the kind of consideration that it needs, and we can have a free and fair election. And we would also like, they said, to have an Afrikaner Volksfront. They wanted a strongly federal system in which Afrikaners who wanted to could live in a Volksstaat with a considerable autonomy from ANC rule over the rest of the country. They were believed to have the capacity to mobilize about 100,000 soldiers. Mandela said of them, they experienced, they're knowledgeable, they know the country far better than we do. In other words, if they'd ever gone up against the Volksfront in a battle, this was not something that could be won. It was, however, possible to weaken the Volksfront in other way. And in particular, they hoped to divide it, because the Volksfront had found it difficult to exclude the Afrikaner Weerstandsbeweging, which was a rather splinter right-wing group which didn't have much legitimacy, unlike, I think, the respect which Constant Viljoen commanded. but which was rather a maverick organization and difficult to control. And that became very evident when events in Boipatong started heating up. And Boipatong was going to be reincorporated on the 27th of April when the election was going to be held. It wasn't altogether clear whether it was going to participate in the election. It wanted more time to think about that. And while it was thinking, the ANC bussed thousands of MK fighters and youths into Mabato, where days of rioting and looting began. And after a couple of days of this, President Lucas Mangope, as he then was, called on the Volksfront to help put down the violence and leave the TEC with less of an excuse to deposing. So the Volksfront came in, but so too did the AVA. They'd been instructed to stay away, but they sent a convoy in as well. When Viljoen saw that, he insisted that they had to leave, and they did turn around and leave. But at that point, the Boipatong Defence Force, which had apparently been infiltrated by some MK elements, mutinied, refused to provide the Volksfront with the weapons that had been promised. So they too decided that they had to leave. 2 of their men were shot as they left, presumably by people in the BOP Defence Force, but it was an ordered withdrawal. Nevertheless, it made Viljoen feel that he couldn't possibly risk any kind of armed confrontation. With the RVOBS being so erratic, so unwilling to take orders, he didn't think that it was worth the risk. Even if he managed to obtain a Volksstaat, unless the ANC agreed, he would never be able to hold it against their opposition and that of the rest of the world. So he agreed that he ought to rather register a party, the Freedom Front, now the Freedom Front Plus, and they registered for the election at the very last moment and were on the ballot paper and in the poll. So what had been a powerful force of resistance really came to an end with that decision by Viljoen, which was a responsible, sensible decision to make. But it was also very much what the ANC had hoped to maneuver, and the events of Boipatong had done just that.
And Anthea, I saw the documentary in which you featured Tainted Heroes. And in that documentary, which covers the People's War a lot, you mentioned that journalists were also intimidated during this entire struggle. They were intimidated to represent the ANC in a much more positive light. And specifically, you said something along the lines of, if they attended meetings, they had to add extra zeros to the number of people that attended those meetings.
Indeed. The institute for which I worked in the early 1990s organized a workshop at that time because there were a number of Black journalists who came to us and said there's a new form of censorship in the townships, and it's more chilling and more persuasive than anything that the National Party government has ever done. And they explained it, and we held a workshop where they were able to come and talk about the kind of pressures that they face. And there was one journalist who said, when we report on things in the townships, and a particular organization has organized a meeting at which 20 people were present, well, then we know that we have to add on a couple of noughts, because if you're not adding on at least 2 or 3 noughts, then you're against the struggle. And heaven help you if the youngsters call you and they think that you're against the struggle. And this, of course, is in the context of the necklace execution and the huge fear it generated among people that they would be burned to death in this particularly horrible way. And so this journalist also explained that, the press, the journalists, Black journalists living in the townships, knew pretty much what was going on. They could have said much more about the coercion that was being used to push people into participating in the political struggles. They could have written much more about the attacks on the ZAPA and other BC organizations, as well as on the IFP. But it wasn't worth it, because if you were against the struggle and you got cornered by the youngsters, they would make you pay for it. So he said, we wrote about 40 or 50% of what was happening in the townships, but the other 50% we left out. And 50% is a lot. It meant that the news that was coming out of the townships was heavily skewed and in only one way. And that was indeed a form of censorship which was extraordinarily effective. I think what also happened in the context of the media was that, as we subsequently learned, there were various journalists in prominent positions in the media who were very sympathetic to the ANC, sometimes even closet members of the ANC or the SACP. And so they also had an interest in in skewing the news in a way that would make the ANC the heroes and turn its rivals into the villains of the piece.
I think you mentioned in the book that Max de Preez has admitted that that's what happened, that he favored the UDF and the ANC too much during that time, and he now regrets it, something along those lines.
Something along those lines. Perhaps that's putting it slightly strongly. I think he said that, as people on the left, we were always sort of suspicious of anybody who was on the right and more sympathetic to the ANC. But after a while, I think he said something like, we realized that the ANC was just using us, that they didn't really have an interest in democracy, that we were just useful to them in their struggle for power at the time. There was also a statement made by somebody called Hans Pienaar, who used to work for Freya Weekblad. And that was interesting too, because he said there was never any clear evidence about the third force, which perhaps we should talk about too. But every week, he said, we would write about the third force, and we would have on the front page a drawing, a monstrous sort of visage towering over its puny victims. And we would generate a sense of fear around the third force. And he said we used the term so often that it became a household name, even though we knew there was no clear evidence of it.
So on that note, was there any evidence that there was a third force, that the National Party assisted the IFP in an event like Boipatong?
Mm-hmm. All right, well, let's start with Boipatong, because there's always some evidence, but it crumbles under scrutiny. So in the case of Boipatong, when the ANC made its allegations about the police, there were monitors of the violence who seemed to be allied to the ANC, who confirmed the stories, who said, yes, people had been seen being transported in the police Caspers, being helped out of the police Caspers so that they could launch their attack. That at times the police Caspers actually broke houses down so that they could more easily attack the people within them. That when they retreated with their loot, they were able to load this into police Caspers, who took them back off to KwaMadala. And then there was a sort of select group of journalists who seemed to be given access to the residents of Boipatong, most of whom were not accessible, and who confirmed this information. But de Klerk naturally wanted to get to the bottom of the allegations. So the first thing that he did was to call in the Goldstone Commission, which was headed by Judge Richard Goldstone, a judge who in the apartheid era had made it very clear that he had no sympathy for apartheid, had helped to make the separate, segregated residences, group areas, impracticable. And Judge Goldstone came in, he brought in British policing experts. They said they could find no evidence of a police role at all. Goldstone himself heard testimony from a witness who said, I saw one of the raiders being loaded into a Clasper. So they went and had an inspection in loco, and it became clear he couldn't have seen what he claimed to have seen. And then Goldstone bowed out in favor of the criminal trial, because it was very clear where the murderers had come from, KwaMadala. So in the end, there were 19 residents of KwaMadala who were put on trial for murder. And one of the critical issues in the case was whether the police had helped them. So 120 residents of the township were called as witnesses, and about 95% of them said there was no police role. They had seen what had happened, and the police had not been involved. There were 3 or 4 who talked about a police role, but under cross-examination, again, it became clear that they couldn't have seen what they claimed to have seen. So their evidence was discredited. And at the end of the day, 17 people from KwaMadala were convicted of murder. They weren't sentenced to death, however, because the judge accepted that they were all people who had fled from ANC attacks in the past, and therefore had this, I suppose, this need to fight back against the ANC. And then it was interesting too that when the Truth Commission was established, you got conflicting views. In the Truth Commission report itself, it simply reported that the police were involved, didn't cite any new evidence to support that, didn't refer to the court trial, which it disputed and rejected all this evidence. It just simply made a finding, which is what the DRC often did. But when the Amnesty Committee had to decide whether to give amnesty to the people involved in the Boipatong massacre, it looked again at all the evidence of whether the police had been involved. and it came to the conclusion that it had not been. So, and the amnesty proceeding was much more of a sort of quasi-court proceeding in which you had the leading of evidence and the opportunity to cross-examine and so on. So the amnesty finding was a much more credible one than the conclusion reached in the report. There are other evidence which is sometimes cited for the third force. One would be the Caprivi training, which didn't involve the police so much, but this took place in 1986. And evidence came out that the South African Defence Force had trained 150 young members of Inkatha in what the army said was principles of self-defense, and what the ANC said was so that they could operate as a hit squad. And this came before the Goldstone Commission. And in 1993, having looked at the evidence, he was very critical of the army for having provided that training, and then of all the secrecy which had surrounded it, which had helped all these rumors to take root. But at the end, he said there is no evidence whatsoever that that training was provided for hit squad purposes. And again, the whole issue revived once more in 1996 when Magnus Milan, who was a former defense minister, and the National Party government was charged with murder, together with a number of Caprivi trainees, over the KwaMakuta massacre. Now, this took place a number of years previously, January 1987, in KwaMakuta, a township south of Durban. And the victim of the massacre was Willie Ntuli, who was a known Inkatha member, and 12 of his relatives. They were all in their house. Petrol bombs were thrown into it at night. They were forced to leave. They were mown down by waiting gunmen armed with AK-47s as they came out. And at the time, it was pretty much seen as probably an MK hit, though nobody exactly knew. But now it was alleged that it was Milan and the Caprivi trainees who had carried out this massacre, the Caprivi trainees using their hit squad skills. So you had a trial and a very, again, careful analysis of the evidence by the trial judge. And in the end, he could find no evidence that the Caprivi training was for hit squad purposes. He thought it was for self-defense purposes. And in terms of the actual massacre, he just found that all the prosecution witnesses had lied, that they seemed to have been coached, that on one particular key issue, a police witness had testified quite falsely and probably deliberately so. And so he acquitted all the accused. But what was always odd, too, about trying to blame General Milan and the Caprivi trainees for it was that it did kill members of Inkatha. And the argument was that the real target had been Victor Ntuli, Willie Ntuli's 21-year-old son, who was a member of the UDF. And the argument was that it was really Victor, the 21-year-old son, who owned the house. And they never looked at the fact that Victor had not been living at the house for a good 3 weeks or so before the attack took place. So lots of doubts and questions as to the validity of the story that was told to support the third force theory. And in the end, it crumbled under investigation.
And Anthea, the common idea is that it was essentially Ramaphosa and Roelf Meyer that handled these negotiations. But a person like Frans Cronje has also said that's not really true. It always was between Mandela and F.W. de Klerk, and everyone else was merely a carrying messages. What do you think is the case?
I think it's probably true that Ramaphosa and Roelf Meyer were indeed the key negotiators who met very often. But they met very often at a time when the ANC had already changed the rules of the negotiating process in the way that I talked about. At Cadessa, de Klerk had found himself supported by 10 other participants, and so he'd won on an important vote. By the time Roelf Meyer and Cyril Ramaphosa began talking, it was after the record of understanding. It was after effectively how the ANC had got de Klerk through the Boipatong and Bishum massacres and all the ferment that those caused, to agree to a process where essentially the National Party and the ANC would negotiate, and then what they agreed would be passed on to the rest. But de Klerk was an enormously weak negotiating position. He'd already had to capitulate. The violence showed no signs of ending. he was being told all the time that the only way to end the violence was to have an interim administration and then an ANC government, because an ANC government would, of course, not be involved in all the third force violence for which he was guilty. But so long as the world believed that the third force was responsible, then that ANC claim made sense to them, and he was in a weak position. It's sometimes also been suggested that the ANC was more ruthless than de Klerk, that they were willing to keep on with violence against rivals and against ordinary people. There were a whole number of random attacks on commuters that began in late 1993. There were the Appler attacks on Wits, which seemed to have been perpetrated at least with some kind of alignment with MK. And if you wanted the violence to stop, and if you wanted a stable society, then perhaps it really was important to agree to what the ANC was saying it needed, and which it said would be the best thing for the country. So I think that Ramaphosa and Meyer were indeed important negotiators, but that what Ramaphosa was constantly relying on was the ANC's use of negotiations as a terrain of struggle in a continued people's war. This is what they had also learned from Vietnam. It was one of the most important lessons from Vietnam, that you intensify the violence, that you delay all the key decisions until the very last moment, preferably when you have a pressing deadline, which means there can be no postponement. And then you up the pressure politically, economically, socially. There's this terrible kind of collapse of the society. And you say it can all end if you agree. And people will tend to agree.
And Anthea, what's also fascinating in your book is how you lay out that, I mean, for all intents and purposes, the 1994 election was almost a disaster. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, indeed. This was, of course, an absolutely crucial election for the ANC, and I think they were still worried that they didn't necessarily have the support they would need to win it freely and fairly. So what else could be done? And one of the first things that was done through what Stover called their famous victory in negotiations was to set up an effectively ANC-dominated but supposedly independent organization called the Independent Electoral Commission, which was to run the first election, the 1994 poll. Had no experience in doing it and seemed to be staffed very much by ANC people. One can't say that all the commissioners were uniformly ANC, but the staff seemed to be pretty much uniformly ANC. That was the allegation from both the IFP and the PAC and other organizations too. Certainly they were not ready or prepared, despite the fact that they very often made that claim in the run-up to the election. But the ways in which they weren't ready and prepared seemed odd. So, for example, the IFP came so late into the election that its name couldn't be included on the ballot paper. It had already been printed. So you had to have a sticker for the IFP, which was added on to the ballot form. In the polling station, you would go to a polling station, the people handing out the form would give you the form and the sticker and put the sticker on, and then you could go and vote for the IFP if that was your preference. But very often there weren't ballot forms at all in the areas where the IFP had strong support, particularly in the East Rand and Soweto, other parts of the PWV area. There were huge shortages of both the ballot papers and the stickers, and the same in KwaZulu-Natal. So very often it's just physically impossible to cast a vote for the IFP. And many other people were barred from casting a vote at all because the ballot papers weren't made available. Then the other thing that happened was that because so many ballot papers were missing, on the 27th of April, which was now supposed to be really, just the last day of the election, maybe a bit of mopping up the next day, so many people had been barred from voting that they decided they'd better have 8.7 million more ballot papers printed overnight, rushed by army helicopters to the stations, particularly in rural areas. So you now had about 87 million ballot papers that had been printed, and you needed 44 million at most, even if you got 100% turnout. So there was a huge number of ballot papers out there somewhere without adequate control over them. And that raised concerns that there might, in fact, have been ballot stuffing, that people who were sympathetic to the ANC, who was within the IEC, had the opportunity, if nothing else, to bump up the number of ballots for the ANC. And then the IEC decided that there could be no ballot reconciliation when it came to the count. They couldn't make sure that there was a match between the number of ballots that had been handed out and the number of votes that had been cast at a particular station. They said it's all become too confusing. Some of the ballot papers have serial numbers if they were printed early, and others don't because they were printed late. And Judge Crickler said, this is not about ballot reconciliation, it's about political reconciliation. That's what we're going to focus on. But of course, it meant that there was even more scope now for fraud, because a lot of valid votes could be discarded and people wouldn't know if you didn't have this fundamental control. And the IFP complained that their enemies controlled the election. It was too difficult for their supporters to go and vote. The PAC said that the Independent Electoral Commission was absolutely full of ANC people who were trying to decide that they were going to win the election for the ANC. The National Party wanted something like 1.5 million votes at least set aside, and the DP likewise, often because there was a big discrepancy between the number of national and regional votes. And it seemed unlikely that if somebody had actually cast a vote on the national level, they didn't also cast a vote on the regional. Too many discrepancies. There were some voting stations with more than 100% turnout. So overall, it seemed that there was chaos and there was probably fraud in both the conduct of the vote and the count. And in the end, it was so difficult to compute an accurate result that it was reported in the Mail and Guardian, of all papers and elsewhere, that Judge Crickler had to give up on trying to compute an accurate vote. That he'd become a negotiator, that he was now talking to the parties about what objections, etc., they were willing to withdraw, so that at the end of the day, a result could be declared. And Judge Crickler, as I write in my book, was very strongly denied that. He said that is not so. It wasn't up to him whether parties withdrew their objections or not, and every single ballot was fully and freely and fairly counted. But there are too many questions about the conduct of the election and of the count to make that as credible as one would like it to be.
And individuals like Ramaphosa, Mandela, FW de Klerk, they were briefed on this, but they all decided, okay, we have to call this a free and fair election.
Yes, I think that the ANC felt that they had gained enough. They were confident they'd got over the 50% level. And it would be terrible to have the election nullified, would simply put them back sort of to having to redo the same thing all over again. De Klerk, of course, wanted his bold moves to lead to success. He had unbanned the ANC, the SSBP, allowed Mkhonto to come back, believed that he was leading the country to a bright new dawn, and a failed, fraudulent election would be very bad news. And for Buthulezi, he could see that they'd done well in KwaZulu-Natal. And there was a sort of interest, perhaps, at the top leadership level in accepting the result. Because if you didn't, you got flung into the vortex of the People's War once again. And that's a pretty chilling prospect for people who've gone through it once over. So the results were declared and they were widely accepted. I think there was an EU mission that came into the country some months later, produced a report that sort of talked about it was sufficiently sufficiently okay. I can't remember the exact words. It was not a glowing report, but it was nor was it a harsh condemnation.
Interesting. It's sufficiently okay. But
that's my paraphrase.
Yeah, but I mean,
I'm sure they more elegantly.
Any way they put it, I mean, how can you describe? Either it was fair or it wasn't. I mean, these adjectives or but Anthea, subsequent elections. How do you rate subsequent elections? Do you trust the IEC to this day? Do you think this? Because a lot of people are saying, okay, just wait until 2024, things will change then. But I mean, what can happen is the IEC can prevent that change. Do you trust that organization?
Well, apart from whether one trusts the IEC, there's also the question of whether you can trust the new electoral bill that's presently wending through Parliament. Now, this has arisen because in 2020, the Constitutional Court said that it's unconstitutional not to allow independents to contest seats for Parliament. They've always, people have always had to be linked to political parties. That was the only way in which you could obtain representation. They struck that down. You said Parliament must, by it was supposed to be June 2022, craft a new law that will make it possible for independents to stand for election as well. Parliament dragged its heels. It's been given a 6-month extension by the Constitutional Court, so it has basically until December 2022 to craft this law. But the trouble with this law is that, according to experts that I've read, and what I think I see in a very complicated bill, it will be possible for the bigger parties in particular to draw substantial benefit from the way in which the votes are counted. You'll have, once the votes for the independents have been taken into account, you'll sort of take all those votes off the table, and then you'll divide the remaining votes among the parties. So the parties automatically have to get less than the independents have to get, because there's already now a smaller pool of available votes left. But in essence, what it amounts to, according to experts whose opinions I think I trust, is that it will be possible for the biggest party to win something like 51 seats with 45% of the vote, and perhaps with even less, depending on how this plays out. With the complication of the independent votes as well, it will no longer be a straight proportionality in the way that we're used to. Now, if that is so, and if that bill continues, becomes law, and that's the basis on which we conduct our election, the ANC will derive considerable advantage and unfair advantage from that. We were also struck a couple of years ago by the IEC, as part of a very technical electoral amendment bill, saying that it should have the power to decide on a voting method, effectively by regulation. And we wondered whether a voting method would be an electronic voting method. And unfortunately, it is possible to manipulate electronic voting to a greater extent than manual voting, because the manual voting process is much more transparent all the way through, and it can be carefully monitored by human beings all the way through. Whereas when you have an electronic system, most people don't understand the software, and it really is very difficult for opposition parties to be able to monitor what's been done by the computer inside its own processes. So there's a risk that it can be set up in a way to give unfair advantage to an incumbent. That particular proposal was defeated. The Institute, Dear South Africa, various other organizations really rallied around, and that particular clause was taken out. But I don't think it means that the ANC has given up on the idea of introducing electronic voting if it can. It seems to have worked for in Venezuela, and it therefore may be good enough for us too.
Yeah, with the ANC, you have to keep your eyes open. But Anthea, I see we're running out of time. Thank you again for making the time to join us. I want to give you one last opportunity if you want to add anything or answer a question you'd hope I'd ask you. Do you see light at the end of the tunnel? And the light is not another train coming. Is there hope?
Yes, I think there is hope. Perhaps one other point I wanted to make, comparing the 1994 election and the current election. 1994, we really were still just coming out of the vortex of the People's War. So 1,500 deaths in the first 4 months of 1994. It creates a level of fear, which thank goodness we do not have now. But in terms of the hope, yes, I think that for a long time, South Africans have, to use a sort of animal analogy that the IRR has developed, seen the ANC as the big buffalo. He's very confident that his power is going to remain, and the EFF as its little calf. And they've been waiting for the big lion to come and bring down the big buffalo. And there doesn't seem to be much prospect of a big lion. But on the other hand, we might get a pack of wild dogs. And apparently wild dogs are very successful hunters. So you could get a number of smaller opposition parties, the DA, Action South Africa, the Freedom Front Plus, a whole number across the political spectrum, working together with one goal of making sure that the support for them goes up to the point where the ANC is trounced and where they can then form a coalition government. And wild dogs will tend to snap and snarl at each other, and perhaps that's what we've been seeing a little bit between some of these parties in some of the metros. But there's a big prize here. And if the wild dogs can really move together, come to the right policy ideas, win sufficient power, and then implement them, South Africa really does have hope of a better future. And I think we're closer to that than we have been for decades.
Absolutely. Let's hope that happens. But Anthea, thank you so much for joining us again. To our viewers, you enjoyed this content, so please like this video, share it as widely as possible, and subscribe to our channel. My name is Donald. You've been watching WorldView.
Thank you, Donald, and thank you to your viewers.